My father died a little less than a month ago, and I didn't go to the funeral. Everybody in my family that I've talked to is upset with me. I understand from the ones I've talked to that there are others who are upset as well, and probably everybody that went to the funeral who knows that I exist is upset with me or thought I was not a good son. So why didn't I go, and how do I feel about death and my father and all that? Perhaps as good a way as any to start is a story about a conversation he and I had. I was doing something reprehensible, I'm not sure what he considered disrespect toward him or my mother. I forget if it was directed toward both of them or just my mother. As I remember, what he said was, "You should respect her because she's your mother." And I said, "Every female dog in town has puppies, and having offspring is not sufficient grounds for respect." And needless to say, he wasn't too happy with that answer, and at the same time, I don't think he really understood it. And a lot of the people I have talked to about going to the funeral or not going to the funeral have said, well, you should do it as a sign of respect for your father. My mother said, it's a way for you to honor him, and you should have done that. You should have gone to the funeral and honored your father, honored the memory of your father. Those words, respect, let's talk about that. I've talked before about pride and how, with my understanding of what we human beings are, pride is a nonsensical sort of emotion and idea. If you see people as I do, as totally enmeshed in the natural world, in that we take in stimuli from the outside, and based on our previous inputs, the things we've learned, and our biological predilections and programming, decisions emerge, and we are not often conscious of the whole process of how things are evaluated, how any one particular decision emerges from a very impossibly high number of calculations without there being any kind of an entity that's actually responsible for them. You could say the brain is the actual decision maker, but it really is like your car. And it's responding to the environment and to what it knows in the same way that your car or any other appliance you have responds to the inputs that it gets from you. Like you push your foot on the gas pedal and the car decides to speed up. If you can call that a decision, there is an event, there's an action that occurs, something happens as a result of that input, and you can look at that as a decision. But at any rate, if pride is nonsensical, then it's also nonsensical to respect someone for their decisions and the things that they do. To respect someone is giving credence and approval to this idea that there is this thing inside of them that was responsible for what they did, independently of anything else, made the decision that resulted in the action. Respect is as nonsensical as pride is. And what I prefer to use myself, the feeling or the thought that I think is appropriate, is to appreciate something. I appreciate the fact that I can get in my car and have it take me places, or I can get on BART and have it take me places. I appreciate that. It's an enhancement to my experience of life, and I appreciate it because I'm the kind of a machine who's learned to appreciate that sort of thing. So I don't get any credit for my appreciation either. But nonetheless, I'm aware of the contribution that people and things and events, phenomena make to my life. And in that sense, I appreciate my father. And I appreciate the effects that he's had and the benefits that he has been to me in my life. I told him that when he was alive on numerous occasions. I told him what it was about him that I appreciated, the things he had done and how he had contributed to my life. That's the closest thing to what other people consider respect that I can come, is to appreciate things. As far as his funeral goes, let me tell you, I grew up in a small town in the South, if you didn't know this, and I grew up as a Christian. And everyone that I know in that town is a Christian, and all my relatives are Christians. My father had a Christian funeral. Even without the religious aspect, these people are very traditional. And they look at respect and pride and shame and all those other things in a very traditional, conventional way. And there's no one in that whole area that I have ever experienced. Now, there may be someone, but I've never experienced contact with anyone who has any comprehension of my perception of respect and pride and so forth. I am, in that environment, totally alien. And I was, in that sense, an alien to my father. There were things about me that he could appreciate because I did things that enhanced his life and my mother's life that he appreciated, and he appreciated that. But as far as us having a conversation where we talked about these things, it never happened. I have had conversations with my mother, who is a little more open and quite a bit more intellectual than he was. And she can, in a way, intellectually consider some of the things that I have said, although they are totally alien to her, and she has no sympathy or appreciation of them. She is really appalled by most of the things that I consider to be the way the world is. I have one relative, I have a cousin, who is pretty intellectual, and he's a poet, and he is a newspaper guy, so he is literate. He's very literate and fairly wide-read, especially in literature. And I can talk to him about these things, and in fact has been fairly interested in Buddhism, has pursued Buddhism in some way for a number of years. So he's aware of those aspects of my belief system, but most of it is really alien to him, and he is in many ways a very traditional person. His feelings about his own mother and father are very conventional. So he, I'm sure, is not too sympathetic toward me. He may be tolerant in some way, but he probably thinks, like most everyone else, that I did a bad thing. So most of my life, I have pretended to be something other than I am. I have pretended to be a fairly conventional person and a very traditional person, and especially in that environment in my hometown. Partly not to embarrass my parents, partly not to cause them any more discomfort than necessary. But I've grown tired of pretending. For one thing, it doesn't really matter what those people think of me because I live 2,500 miles away. Really, it doesn't much matter what anybody thinks of me because the cashier at the Safeway is still going to take my money even if she thinks I'm a reprehensible dastard. The people at the post office will accept my letters for mailing. It doesn't really matter what they think of me unless it affects my own feeling about myself. On the one hand, I'm not anxious to deal with people's overt hostility. I don't want people spitting at me on the street or shouting out names at me or anything like that. That affects my experience of the world and of my life in a way that I'd just as soon avoid. But as I say, I lived 2,500 miles away from any of those people, so those kind of repercussions are not going to happen. Probably wouldn't happen anyway. They're much too polite. So the fact that there are a fairly small number of people in that area of the world who think I'm a reprehensible character is not really of too much consequence to me. What sort of pushed me over the brink? I went down for a couple of weeks. My dad had been in the hospital. In fact, he was in the hospital when I went down there. My mother called me with the anticipation that he was going to die just at any minute. At least that's what she told me. I thought, well, hey, I haven't been down in a while. I'll go home and say goodbye to my father or whatever. So I did. He went from the hospital to a rehabilitation center, which was probably pointless. He should have gone to hospice, but that wasn't my decision. So I was there at the nursing home as well. He had a lot of visitors. He had quite a few visitors, some family and friends of family, and a lot of friends of theirs from the churches that they had been affiliated with. That's another story. They were affiliated with one particular sect when I was a kid and growing up, and I, in fact, was a member of that sect. And then something happened when my kid brother died of AIDS, and that's, as I say, that's another story. But they ended up shopping around for a while, but they had still a lot of old friends, and they came around and tried to console. Well, I had a conversation, a brief, very brief encounter with a guy who I had known for years, although since I was a kid, although I hadn't seen him very frequently in a very long time. But, of course, we still recognized each other and so forth. So he and I found ourselves outside the door of my dad's room. Something was happening. I forget what. He said to me in this very quiet, extremely pious tone, intended to be comforting, I'm sure, that he knew this must be a hard time for me, and I had his sympathy. I nodded my head as if I agreed with him, but the truth is that I was not having a hard time. The whole experience, and seeing my dad lying there, not really being cognizant a lot of the time, but when he had moments of clarity and was able to respond and initiate conversation with people in a way that if you hadn't had a longer exposure to him, you wouldn't think that there was any problem with his mental faculties. But in fact, he had had growing dementia for a number of years, which doesn't necessarily mean it was constant. It was intermittent. As I said, he had moments of clarity. But for one thing, I have spent some time, and I've talked about this earlier too, contemplating the idea of my death, my own death and death in general. So it's not something that is frightening to me or that I dread for myself or anyone else. It's something we're all going to go through, and we can accept it with grace, or we can go kicking and screaming, however you like, or protesting and grieving. But to me, for one thing, death for the person who dies is an instant termination and erasure of everything that ever happened to them. Their entire experience of life disappears. That's what I feel. So the only thing really that remains is the memories of them in other people's minds and whatever actions they've taken in the world that had some sort of transformative effect. So those things survive, and of course, their molecules survive in one form or another, but that person as a thinking human being with memories, that person disappears with death. So my father is not around anywhere in the universe as he was. He's not experiencing anything, and I don't expect to experience anything either. When I think of him, I have had a thought. I can remember I can remember one occasion where I had a thought. I thought about him sitting on the front porch as he used to do and looking out. For a moment, I had a feeling of missing him. And I realized in the next moment how pointless that was. That a preferable way for me to think about him rather than think about, oh, I'll never see him again, I'll never hear his voice, I'll never talk to him, is to remember those things about him and those events and occasions, to enjoy the memories that I have of him. And really, the experience of another person in our head is all we ever have. Our personal experience of a person is the totality of who they are. In our experience, they do have an independent existence, I believe, and they think things and do things when we're not around that we're not aware of and have no memory and recollection. But we really never experience the world as they do. We never really get inside them and experience their experience. So our only real contact with a person exists in the thoughts that we have and the memories in our head. So that's really all my father has ever been, was an experience in my brain. And that's still there as much as when he was alive. There won't be any new ones of those, but the ones I have are valuable. Many of them enhance my life still. So I think about him, and I think that's the only sense in which I experience him that might be sort of universally appreciated, even by Christians, to say that I have thoughts of my father, that I have fond memories, that I have fond thoughts of my father, is something that anyone can appreciate, even though they don't appreciate the fact that I didn't go to his funeral. To me, those memories and recollections that I have are the only valuable thing of him that's left. And what other people think of him, or what they think of me, one thing that came up was honoring my father. Honoring a person is a sort of community activity. It's a sort of cementing behavior in a community that the members get together and they recall the departed one. It gives everyone present the feeling that they are a part of the community, and that perhaps, no doubt, if things continue as they have in the past, they will have that same sort of recognition and honoring when they die. And that gives people some comfort who have a conventional orientation to life. But those sorts of traditional ceremonies that evolved as a way to give families and communities cohesiveness are, I think, a problem in this day and age. They evolved, I think, for very good evolutionary reasons. The people that had those kinds of community cementing traditions and ceremonies had a tendency to take care of each other, to protect each other from outside forces. That has been valuable in the course of evolution. The people who had those kinds of traditions, and ones that were effective, survived and had more offspring and continued the tradition. So they have been useful in the history of human social development. But there are also negative consequences of identification with family and community, which on the next level is with country and nationality, or on another larger term, feelings of community with others of one's own race, what has been the experience of human beings is that those kind of feelings of community have resulted in hostility between communities and wars and conflicts and all sorts of violence of one group of people who identify with one particular group or religion or country inflicting violence on another group. While evolutionarily you can understand how such a thing would survive, it had some positive evolutionary consequences for the people who held those beliefs because they're here. Their descendants are here, the ones that survived the conflicts. But the conflict itself has been detrimental. And given the scale of communication and transportation in the world today and the levels of destruction that people are capable of, the consequences of those sorts of traditions and ceremonies are severe. And yet they linger on. I mean, they have a great deal of survival value. If they didn't, they probably wouldn't have survived. But I think our survival as a species depends on developing identifications on a broader scale so that instead of identifying with these small groups and communities and religions and races and nations, is that it would be beneficial at this point in time to develop a broader identification with humanity as a whole, so that a large number of the conflicts that we currently have could be eliminated. Because of their conditioning, people fear for the survival of their offspring and their families and their communities and their religion. And when they find themselves pressed, they will defend those entities in extreme ways and do violence and annihilate themselves in the interest of enhancing the survival of their families or their groups. And I'm afraid this is not going to end anytime soon. I mean, if you can imagine, how would one eliminate that problem when the fundamental problem arises from identifying oneself as a member of a particular group and then committing violence against groups who threaten you're the one that you identify with? It would take an educational enterprise of vast proportions, and it would have to start with infants, that you eliminate or at least neutralize the effects of all those traditions of identification and present them with the alternative instead of identifying with humanity as a whole. But it has to result in the attitude of thinking that, well, perhaps my nationality or my religion or my family won't survive. We don't seem to have the advantages that it would take to propagate ourselves in the world. Many people find themselves economically disadvantaged, and they're either always going to be poor or they're going to starve to death. Well, not too many people are going to stand by and see that without doing something about it. So before you could begin this vast re-educational project, you have to eliminate the economic and survival problems that people have. And really, I could talk forever, I suppose, people do, about why conflicts arise. And in large measure, it's this identity issue, in seeing oneself as separate from the rest of humanity. I mean, right now, you could say that the reason the United States is doing such violence in Iraq and Afghanistan are really because of corporate interests in the United States. Even if that were clear and apparent and proclaimed by all those people involved, what it would take to change really is for the people in charge of those corporations to identify themselves less with their own personal financial well-being, and their place in the corporate structure is what motivates most of them, and what they think is good for the corporation, and to sacrifice that for the broader good of humanity, and to pursue processes that might lead to more cooperation and less competition for scarce resources. And I think it's possible. It's very idealistic to think that, well, the world population is not going to be able to continue to increase indefinitely, but what happens is that when people get educated and when their lifestyle reaches a certain level, they don't have so many kids. Europe is having the problem right now of trying to keep the native population, the Germans and the French, keep them renewing themselves so that the Germans and the French don't disappear as a national entity. People don't have as many babies when they're well off and when they're educated, when they don't have the religious incentives of go forth and populate the earth. So where does one begin? How do you go about solving the world's problems? The approach I take is that the problem is basically in the individual human being, in the way that we look at ourselves and think about ourselves, identify ourselves. The idea that my ideas, and I say that in a rather possessive way, but they're not really my ideas. They're ideas that have come from a lot of sources, and I may articulate them in a kind of an individual way, given that my history is individual, but I'm not really making anything new here. But the idea that this approach to living and to oneself is going to spread like wildfire in the world would be a little unlikely and unrealistic. Nonetheless, one does what one can, and here I am, spreading the word. That's I come from a long line of preachers, and I guess maybe some of that stuck to me. But talking about the origin of ideas, and this particular set of ideas of how we look at ourselves. When I was 17 years old, I graduated from high school, and the summer before I started college, I read a book by Philip Wiley, and it's called Essay on Morals, and how a kid in a small town in the South came across this book is something that I don't remember, and seems really kind of astonishing in retrospect, because it's not typical of the kind of literature that anybody else in my community was reading that I know of. I have acknowledged this book and Philip Wiley all my life, not every day and to every person I talk to, well, this came from Philip Wiley, but it has always been back there somewhere that this book changed my life. He was the first person that I had read that asked questions that I had never heard anyone else ask before. And when I asked myself those questions, and when I looked at those issues, I saw that I had been totally gullible all my life. Not to blame myself for it, because I had no way of knowing until I encountered this book. And that's really the way all of us are. We're stuck with whatever experience comes across our path. And I consider myself very fortunate, and I appreciate very much that my path happened across this book. I was thinking about this not long ago. In fact, I was talking to my wife, Eve, about it. And it occurred to me, I lost that copy. I don't know, it might have been a library book years ago when I was 17. I haven't seen it since. But I thought, it just had such an impact on my life, I should get a copy and reread it. So I got a copy, a used copy, and it turns out this is not the edition that I read. This edition is 1947, and I think the issue I had, I read that in 1961, so it was probably a later edition. It was a paperback. It may have changed some. There may have been some revisions in the intervening years. So I'm reading the original, and I was really kind of astonished. On the one hand, I could see definitely where it altered my thinking. And on the other hand, I could see that I hadn't fully appreciated it, that I didn't have the background to fully appreciate it, to put all of its ideas into practice. Too bad I didn't keep a copy and reread it frequently, but I didn't. And so I encountered the experience and the ideas later along in life that helped me, when I went back to it just recently and read it, to appreciate it and to see how really what I had learned was things that he had said, and I just wasn't able to appreciate them at the time. I thought I would read a kind of a long passage. It may seem somewhat familiar if you have listened to any of the earlier tapes. It may seem familiar to things that I have said and talked about, but he's very loquacious. He says things in a very artful, literate kind of way. So the language was not contemporary, although comprehensible, but it's a bit more convoluted than people usually write these days, except for philosophers. Philosophers write very convolutedly. This was a book for the general public, or the more educated of the general public. I may have to interpret here as we go along, but I'm going to just jump right in on page 73, and he's talking about Walter Mitty and how he is a representative of the human condition in many respects. Walter Mitty was a character created by, I think his name was James Thurber, I'm sure of. And he was a character who spent his life imagining great heroic adventures for himself, although he was a quite ordinary person, but his adventures were extraordinary. He was well known at the time that Thurber was writing, and has been read quite a bit since then, and as a person who sort of lives in fantasy and has this fantasy life. But in a way, I think the reason he was so popular and has been popular is that people can see how their own fantasies maybe are not quite so elaborate or involved, but how everyone has a fantasy life that's not totally alien to this idea. To begin, so he's talking about this Walter Mitty character. To the degree that he is able to imagine, Mitty needs must grow to hate the illusions wrought by himself to match his conceit. He may not have the capacities to be a great emancipator or even a great dentist, but because he is a man, he has innately the ability to experience greatness in 10 myriads of ways, solitary, non-conforming, and pure. This he eschews for the warm bottle of self-adulation. So, myself talking here, while he is capable of this kind of human greatness, he doesn't seize the opportunity, and instead he's caught up in all these fantasies. So a little further down the page, I'm going to excerpt a bit here to avoid some of the verbosity. This is the story of the ego. The man by himself invents a picture of himself in the world to satisfy his vanity and his compulsions, and believes he is this image. Even the amateur at reading can get the method of it, watching from little hour to hour what his own brain dishonorably seizes for present advantage, distorts, colors, retracts, asserts, denies, whitewashes, paints out, adds to, in a running succession of miniature lies. Some portion of the man is perpetually disgraced and knows it. This natural mechanism, this interior jurisprudence, which knows better and suffers constant affront, is sometimes called conscience. So, commenting here, he says that we all really, somewhere, whether we're capable of it or not, somewhere we realize that we are lying to ourselves and we are being false to ourselves in the interest of having a better opinion of ourselves. I think that's just ever so true. To continue a few pages later on, 77. Let a man listen to himself, so he may hear his story, and let him say as he did when he was a child, "This is not so. This is true. It does not matter what they tell me." He will reacquaint himself with his animal soon enough. Hairy ape, homicide, cannibal, sunning reptile, and reptilian jaws concealed in the tranquil pool. He will find out that he is hardly God, but the very candor that uncovers this fact will find itself also, and if he persists, he can reverse his process, expunge the original sin, and be a new character to himself, and greater, as easily and naturally as he was able in his youth to recapitulate his biological orders. And just to the side, he talks about the development of the fetus in the womb, how it recapitulates evolution. So anyway, back to Wiley. This candor, as he was saying, I'm repeating there to get the context. This candor, this last, is the millet seed, the grain of mustard. This minute speck turns the trend of vanity. For the protoplasm is amenable, readily creates magnificence from the smallest point of origin. The cobbler can be king in this fashion. To him that has this trifle of primordial candor shall be given the infinite world of time and space, but to him that has it not, everything he has, though it be the world, shall be taken away, and he will decline like old millionaires, toothless, nursing, handing out the largesse of San Simeon or the 10-cent piece of Rockefeller, a peevish nothing, afraid to die, for that he had not conscience. The rich man, as Jesus said, has already inflated his ego to its outmost possibilities by the purchase of heaven on earth, and there is nothing extra between the stars that can be added. Croesus marble nirvana and the golden halls of Midas were the entire competences of their ego, and the cost of it was eternity. To have that, a man must be born again, admit the opposite archetypes, and listen to their true and constant talk in the honest conscience. Then, whatever of fame or power or wealth he may incidentally have, he will not be much in his own eyes, but muchness will be his. So there's Philip Wiley's prescription for world peace, for each of us to look honestly at the things we do and the ideas that arise in our conscious experience, and the urges and the desires that we have, and say, where did that come from? To look at other people and see how they behave. Well, he actually has, at the end of a book, an educational program that starts in childhood and teaches each child about evolution and how our species evolved. Not just evolution, but from there we go on to anthropology. The way that human biological evolution has expressed itself in various cultures around the world. That allows us to get a perspective on our own behavior that we wouldn't necessarily have if we just looked at ourselves in the context of our community and our small group that we came up with, because one has a tendency, without a broader exposure, to rationalize one's own feelings and urges in the context of the group rationalizations and why people do that. Most people aren't capable of doing that. They don't have the background. I didn't have the background when I read the book to appreciate that and to put it into practice. I didn't have the anthropology, for one thing, although I did get a minor degree in anthropology, so that helped. My major was in sociology, which is about why people behave the way they do on a broad level. The differences between Catholics and Protestants and suicide rates and stuff like that. So I did get a lot of education that related. But at the same time, I was caught up in my own biology and in my own culture. And hey, I was a teenager and testosterone levels were high and I was looking to get laid. It's not likely that expounding upon Philip Wiley is going to get me laid, if it even occurred to me to expound on him and his approach to life. So I got caught up in the human condition, in my culture. And I read Playboy magazine, and I wanted to get laid, and I wanted a gorgeous woman with a tiny waist and huge breasts and a great butt. And then, of course, how does one get that? And you have to have some trinkets and baubles and an approach to women that works. So you have to spend a lot of time developing that. And I did. I found, if you listen to the earlier tapes, the ones where I was still doping and fucking and doing all those nasty things, you realize I found an approach that worked. I got laid. At the same time, these ideas were working on me. And at the same time, eventually, I found out, like he says in the book, his description of the millionaire at the end of his life, how it's not really that satisfying. In the long run, one ends up asking, where's it going? What's the point here? You realize the point is not that grand. You're just being an animal, a human being, an animal whose symbol usage is very highly evolved. And because of that, your approach to these biological urges, Wiley talks a lot about instincts, and that sounds a little primitive in a way, but nonetheless, I think it conveys the idea that biology and the way it's channeled by culture largely determines a great deal of our behavior. So I was caught up, and it's been a long road to get me back to a book I read when I was 17, 45 years ago. As the Grateful Dead says, what a long, strange trip it's been. But I'm very happy with the destination. I'm happier than I've ever been in my life. I have managed to divert some of those biological imperatives and avoid their injunctions, the ones that were causing me so much discomfort and conflict with other people and causing other people unhappiness. So as a result, my conscience is a lot clearer than it was in those days. I do less that offends my own sensibility of right behavior. So I think that's very nearly enough for now. I'll end with a bit from a book I'm currently reading. I haven't finished it yet. I could give you a more detailed evaluation at some future time, but I can tell you that it has many wonderful things to offer. It's by Daniel Goleman, Goleman, called Emotional Intelligence. As I say, I haven't finished it, but I was just reading this morning this passage where he quotes the merry adventures of Robin Hood, in which Robin advises, and I'm reading now from page 180. Robin advises a young follower, "Tell us thy troubles, and speak freely. A flow of words doth ever ease the heart of sorrows. It is like operating the waste where the mill dam is overfull." I was thinking about that, and I was thinking how these podcasts, dear listener, fulfill that function for me. There's a flow of words which ease the heart. I don't have any friends. I can talk to my wife. As time has gone on, she understands most of what I say and most of the things I talk about. Her experience is different, and because her experience and mine are different, she doesn't have the same reaction or response or resonance always that I do. She comes closer than any other human being on the planet, and really very closely most of the time. She is really the only person that I talk to about these things. You, whoever you are, in whatever part of the world you live, get to hear me talk about these things as well. And though you're not nearly so responsive as my wife, I can imagine that there's something along the way that makes it worthwhile. To get back to my father's death and a slight parallel there, it's probably totally pointless that I didn't go to my father's funeral as far as having any beneficial effect on the people in my family or my hometown. It's very unlikely that the fact that I didn't go will ever make any of them question their own beliefs and their own feelings, and to ask themselves, why would he do such a thing? And to find in themselves an answer that they could relate to, that would give them some insight into themselves. I think it's very unlikely that will happen. Nonetheless, I couldn't bring myself to pretend to agree with their point of view and to, in fact, reinforce that point of view and to allow them to think that I felt the same way that they did. And they may never understand the things that I have said here. There may be some of you who come much closer to understanding than any one of them ever would. And so whether it will have any effect on them is very unlikely. As unlikely as that I will see world peace in my lifetime. But nonetheless, it may be that a tiny spark is lit in some mind somewhere, that some train of thought is begun, which might have beneficial consequences for that person somewhere along the line. That's my fantasy. And in the meantime, I have talked about my interests and my concerns. And that, it turns out, also according to this emotional intelligence book I'm reading, that has benefits for my health. Even if no one hears or no one understands, the fact that I have spoken and voiced these ideas will, as Robin Hood said, ease my sorrows somewhat. Although I tell you, really, I don't have a lot of sorrows. And I hope you don't have very many sorrows, whoever you are, and I hope your sorrows decrease with time. Goodbye for now.